He said, "If you don't like it, you can leave." The words hung in the air like a door slamming shut. We were standing in the kitchen of the apartment I had mostly paid for, the one with the large window overlooking the parking lot where his friends' cars were already arriving for the weekend trip they'd been bragging about for months. Laughter drifted up through the open window. Beer bottles clinking, engines revving, someone shouting his name. He didn't even look worried when he said it. He leaned against the counter, confident, almost amused, like he was sure I'd stay. Like I always did. I remember the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the smell of the coffee I had made that morning, now cold in my mug. My chest felt strangely calm, as if something inside me had finally settled. So I looked at him, nodded once, and said the simplest words I could. "Okay. I will." He laughed. What he didn't realize was that I had just agreed to something that would quietly unravel everything he was planning next. For most of our relationship, I had been the quiet one people overlooked. Not weak, just quiet. He was the loud personality in every room, the one telling stories with big gestures while his friends laughed and slapped the table. I was usually in the background refilling drinks, smiling politely, listening more than speaking. To them, I was simply his girlfriend. The calm one. The accommodating one. What they never noticed was how much of our life quietly ran through me. The apartment lease was in my name because my credit was better. The savings account that paid most of the bills was mine too. Even the car he proudly drove to his weekend trips was technically registered under my insurance plan. None of it bothered me at first. I believed in building things together. When he said he was between jobs or that money was tight, I stepped in without making it a big deal. I told myself that partnership meant supporting each other during uneven seasons. But over time, the pattern became obvious. My help slowly turned into expectation. My patience became invisibility. And somewhere along the way, he started speaking to me the way people do when they're convinced you'll never walk away. That was the mistake. Because the quiet person in the room is often the one paying the closest attention. The change didn't happen all at once. It arrived in small moments most people would have ignored. At dinner with his friends, someone once asked how we managed our finances. Before I could answer, he laughed and said, "I handle the big stuff." Then he glanced at me like I was supposed to nod along. I did. Another night, when I reminded him the rent was due, he waved a hand dismissively and said, "Relax, you worry too much." His tone wasn't angry, just careless, like the responsibility had always belonged to me anyway. Sometimes it was the way he spoke over me in conversations, finishing my sentences as if he already knew what I meant. Other times it was the jokes. "Without me, she'd probably never leave the house," he once told his friends, smiling like it was harmless. They laughed. I noticed everything. The brief glances, the pauses, the easy confidence in his voice. The quiet assumption that I would always absorb the inconvenience, smooth the edges, keep things running. And every time he dismissed me, something inside me grew calmer. Not sad. Not angry. Just clearer. Because once you start seeing a pattern, it becomes impossible to pretend it isn't there. The moment everything became clear wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened in the quiet space right after he said those words. "If you don't like it, you can leave." He said it casually, almost bored, like he was repeating a line he had used before. His phone buzzed in his hand, one of his friends texting about the trip. I could hear their voices outside, engines idling, music already starting. For a second, I studied his face. Not angry. Not worried. Just certain. Certain I wouldn't go anywhere. And that was when something shifted inside me. I suddenly saw the entire structure of our life for what it really was. The apartment lease with my name on it. The bank account he casually used for shared expenses. The insurance policy covering the car he drove to impress his friends. Every invisible piece quietly held together by me. He thought leaving would hurt me. But leaving would simply remove the foundation he was standing on. That realization didn't make me emotional. It made me precise. When I said, "Okay, I will," it wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the argument anymore. I was thinking about logistics. While he was outside laughing with his friends, I walked into the bedroom and quietly closed the door. Planning, I've learned, is easier when emotions are no longer involved. I opened my laptop and logged into the accounts I had set up years earlier, the ones he rarely thought about because they had always just worked. The savings account connected to the rent. The shared spending card he used during trips. The insurance policy for the car parked downstairs. One by one, I made small adjustments. The shared card was removed from the account. Automatic transfers were stopped. Passwords were updated. The car's insurance coverage, technically registered under my policy, was scheduled for cancellation at the end of the day. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork. My job in financial administration had taught me that most people imagine revenge as confrontation. But the real power usually lives in documents, access, and timing. I packed a suitcase with only what belonged to me: clothes, my laptop, the folder with the lease agreement and account information. Everything else could stay exactly where it was. Outside, someone shouted that they were already late for the airport. I zipped the suitcase closed. They were about to discover that trips are much harder to take when the quiet person who held everything together simply steps away. I carried my suitcase through the living room while the noise from outside drifted through the open window. Laughter, car doors slamming, someone shouting for him to hurry up. He was still in the kitchen scrolling through his phone when I passed by. "Heading out already?" he asked without looking up, assuming I meant for the weekend. "In a way," I replied. I left my key on the counter beside the cold coffee mug and walked out. The hallway was quiet. The elevator hummed softly as it carried me down to the parking level where a rideshare was already waiting. I slid my suitcase into the trunk, took one last glance at the building, and closed the door behind me. By the time they reached the airport, the changes had already started unfolding. His card declined at the check-in counter. The car insurance notification arrived on his phone. The rent reminder, attached to my account, not his, sat unanswered. I didn't need to witness the confusion or the frantic phone calls that must have followed. As the city lights moved past the window of the car taking me away, I felt something simple and steady settle in my chest. For the first time in years, none of his problems belonged to me anymore. I didn't hear from him that night. The first message arrived the next morning. "Why isn't the card working?" Then another. "Did something happen with the insurance?" A few hours later, the tone changed. "Where are you?" I imagined the scene without needing to see it. Him standing at the airport counter while his friends shifted impatiently behind him. Someone checking their watch. Someone else offering to cover the bill, just this once. The quiet realization that the plans he'd bragged about all week were suddenly collapsing. Trips fall apart quickly when the person funding half of it disappears. By the evening, his messages were no longer confused, they were angry. But something interesting happens when you step away from a situation like that. The noise loses its power. The insults, the blame, the sudden apologies, they all sound the same from a distance. Friends eventually notice patterns too. They start asking questions. They remember the small comments, the jokes, the way someone treated the person who was always quietly holding things together. And that's why moments like this matter. Not because revenge feels good, but because walking away from being underestimated changes the story people thought they knew about you, and the one you finally tell yourself. A few weeks later, the silence between us had settled into something permanent. At first, I expected the usual cycle: anger, apologies, promises to change. But once he realized I wasn't coming back to fix anything, the messages slowly stopped. Without me smoothing things over, his life had to run on his own effort. And that was never something he had practiced. Meanwhile, my world grew surprisingly quiet in the best possible way. I moved into a small apartment across the city, one that was entirely mine. No shared accounts, no unspoken responsibilities quietly piling up in the background. Just simple routines: morning coffee by the window, workdays that ended without tension waiting at home. Somewhere along the way, I met someone new. Not in a dramatic, movie-like moment. Just a calm introduction through mutual friends. He listened when I spoke. Asked questions. Noticed things. The difference was subtle but undeniable. Looking back, I realized the most powerful part of leaving wasn't the inconvenience it caused him or the plans that fell apart. It was the moment I understood my own worth again. Because the quietest revenge isn't ruining someone's life. It's building a better one where they no longer have a place in it.